So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go pass it over to the one and only Sherrod Davis, CEO of Ecomap Tech, and to kick us off. So, Sherrod, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joyce. And thanks everyone for being here. I'm really, really excited for this conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about economic signals ecosystem leaders can't afford to ignore in 2026. And I have the privilege of being joined by Matt Salois. Matt is an applied economist and organizational leader focused on helping small business thrive amid economic change. He currently serves as president of Veterinary Management Groups, where he leads economic, strategic, and leadership initiatives supporting more than 2,300 independently owned businesses across the U.S. His work centers on improving productivity, strengthening leadership capacity, and helping owner operators translate economic signals into practical, growth-oriented decisions. Across his various roles, Matt has worked closely with entrepreneurs, professional service firms, trade organizations, and public institutions at the intersection of economic development, innovation, and policy. His work has focused on helping organizations understand long-term structural trends such as productivity growth, workforce dynamics, and demographic change, and apply them in ways that support resilient local and regional economies. Matt, thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. Appreciate the kind introduction. Sometimes introductions feel like eulogies, but I don't think all that would fit on my tombstone. But appreciate the warm introduction.
Yeah, for sure. I think the headline, right, for the audience is like Matt is an expert in the economy and also is a small business advocate. And so
Yes.
we thought that it was a really interesting intersection of experience, sort of bring to our audience for what we hope is a really fruitful conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to the economy. It's ever
Yeah.
evolving, ever changing. So looking forward to digging into that with you, Sherrod, and sharing some insights that will hopefully be of value to your stakeholders and your audience here today.
Awesome. Let me talk a little bit about the structure for today before we jump into the conversation. So as usual, as Joyce mentioned, use the Q&A for questions. We may weave it in throughout the conversation. If there's time, we'll try to get to Q&A at the end as well. We will have some polls throughout the conversation that Joyce will drop in and that we'll try to get Matt's reaction to. And then in terms of our conversation, we're going to start by focusing on like what is the economy, a little bit of economics 101 for the uninitiated. We're then going to talk about the operational on the ground impact of the economy on small business owners. And then finally, we'll talk about what ecosystem builders should do about this economic moment that we are in. Does that sound good to you, Matt?
It sounds perfect. Tall order for under an hour, right?
Yeah,
But we'll get
totally.
through it. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see how much we can get to. To kick us off, Joyce, do you mind dropping in the first poll question? Um, thank you. First couple poll questions. So when you have a minute, respond to that, and then as I mentioned, Matt and I will kind of dig into some of the responses as we continue the conversation. To kick us off, Matt, describe this economic moment that we're in today.
Yeah. Well, what I start off by saying is that, first of all, the economy always looks different from the inside than it often does from the headlines. And, unfortunately, a lot of our opinions on the economy as participants, whether you're a consumer or a business or an entrepreneur, honestly comes from reading those headlines. And so you have to parse out what's really happening from what the media and the headlines are driving you to think what is happening here. And so, when you work with an operating business and as an economist, you realize that, these broad measures that we hear about in the media around GDP and unemployment, they don't really capture the reality within the operating business itself sometimes, right? So GDP, gross domestic product, it's not going to capture what's happening within profitability or margin pressure that a lot of businesses are feeling here. Unemployment, again, really important from a macroeconomic perspective, but doesn't really capture productivity gaps that a lot of businesses and organizations are feeling. Everything feels harder right now and has for the last few years. We've talked so much about inflation the last couple of years for very important reasons, and inflation, thankfully, is cooling, but that doesn't mean cost stress has disappeared for your customers and your clients, right? So that's really important. And so the thing I really would want to get across here is that I don't think we're in a crisis economy, and sometimes the headlines make it feel that way, doom and gloom. But I do think we are definitely in a recalibrating one. And so some of the things we'll get into, Sherrod, I know is, one thing I would say is capital is more selective. It's harder to get financing right now than it was before. It hasn't disappeared, it's just more difficult. Hiring decisions are becoming a lot more disciplined as well within new companies and existing companies. And so the real risk here I want to get across is that it's not necessarily a recession. That's what a lot of the headlines are asking. Are we going into a recession? When is the next recession? And those are important questions. But the one I would really encourage everyone to think about is um, more around misreading a disciplined growth cycle here, which is what we're in, is temporary, and more around planning for um, the next phase of this economy, which always comes through phases, right? And so that's the one you want to be ready for. That's the one you want to be planning for and preparing for, not the one that you're in right now, but the one
Hmm.
that's to come.
That's super interesting. And Joyce, do you mind just giving us the results from that poll when you have a minute? As you think about sort of what the next sort of phase of this economy is going to look like, I think it's important to maybe call out sort of which elements of which you described are cyclical and which ones are structural, right?
Yes.
Like from our perspective, we think that there is a lot that is shifting sort of foundationally as it relates to AI in the economy. And so
Yeah.
to me, it's a little bit difficult to say either way, whether like this is sort of a natural cycle or if this is more of a fundamental shift that we should expect moving forward.
Yeah, and it's always hard to decipher those, I think, even for economists, although they might like to disagree on that one. The analogy I like to use to help understand cyclical or cycle trends from structural trends is just imagine walking a really excitable dog on a very long leash. Like think a Corgi or a Yorkshire Terrier on a 20-foot leash, and you're walking through Central Park. And so every jogger, every runner, every squirrel is going to send that little terrier or corgi off in many different directions, right? And so that's the cycle, right? But the long run trend is your permanent destination. This is where you're going. You're walking through Central Park and you're going to Starbucks. Like that's your destination, right? And so the cycles are going to pull and tug at you in different directions there, but the structural trend is really driving you towards that final destination. And the cycles that you're experiencing can be wildly different from what that structural trend is. That's the challenge, right? And so
Mhm.
we experienced a lot of this coming immediately off the post-COVID years of this boom in spending that was happening at that point in time. And I think a lot of businesses, many of whom have made significant layoffs in the last couple of years since, made decisions thinking that cycle was the new structure, and it wasn't there. And so it's really important to decipher those because you don't want to misinterpret or misdiagnose what you're doing because that's gonna spell the actions and the decisions and the strategies that you make as a decision maker.
Hmm. It's interesting how you described the trends as it relates to today's economy. You've got sort of the workforce pressure, as you mentioned, you've got the capital access pressure, and that actually showed up almost exactly the way you described it in the polls, Matt.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious your work, with 2,300 small businesses, like, are they feeling the workforce pressure as well? And how are you sort of advising them to navigate through that? I know it's a specific sort of sector of small business, but I think it can be a signal that others can learn from as well.
Yeah, advising what I think in the poll here. Oh, I just lost the poll window. I'll see if I can find it. But I think you cautious is what a lot of people, thank you.
Yeah.
What a lot of people are responding there, pretty split on some of the hardest areas for some of these regions here, which isn't surprising, but cautious and concerned. And so I think that's something I'm seeing very consistent in with the small businesses in which I serve, which are veterinary practices here. But the thing I would call out is that caution doesn't mean fear, and it doesn't mean collapse. What it means is that leaders and owners are evaluating decisions a lot more deliberately. And so, in a more disciplined economic environment, which is what we're in, businesses are going to be slower to add fixed costs. They're going to be slower to borrow aggressively. They're going to be more focused on preserving flexibility. And so, what that's going to translate into is delayed hiring, postponing expansion projects, more rigorous budgeting. And that behavior can have the feeling of slowing growth, and it does slow growth, but those behaviors can also strengthen the resiliency of an operation. And so the important question here becomes whether caution turns into paralysis or whether it becomes a strategic discipline. And so, from an ecosystem leader perspective, they can influence that outcome by helping businesses translate caution into operational resiliency, into productivity improvements rather than contraction.
Hmm. That's really interesting, and I think a great segue to our second poll question, Joyce, if you wouldn't mind dropping that as well. And so, as you think about Matt, sort of this what I'll describe as a shift from, I won't say growth at all costs, but there was so much enthusiasm around. Um, New startups, new small business, et cetera. We too are hearing a number of our customers and folks we work with talk about resiliency, talk about survival rates in ways that we hadn't, I think, heard them focus on historically. Do you think that that's a direct sort of reaction to what we're seeing at the economic level, or is there something else at play here?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I think, going back a little bit to cycles versus structural change, what when you're experiencing a bit of a structural change, that shift reveals itself through behavior, right? And one
Mm,
example is, how a business approaches expansion. I think in recent years, we saw many firms and businesses expand quickly because the post-COVID demand environment was so strong and financing was cheap. It was very inexpensive. Today now expansion decisions are deliberate, they're slower, they're more analytical, and business owners, entrepreneurs, they're asking whether an investment clearly improves efficiency or profitability before committing to those resources. So I would really argue here that we're entering a new operating environment rather than just merely completing a cycle in the economy or an adjustment phase. Um, when capital is abundant and demand is robust, even imperfect systems can generate growth. But
mm,
a company with operational weakness might still expand because external conditions compensate for those inefficiencies. But we've seen now stimulus fade, borrowing costs are normalizing, and now those inefficiencies are becoming so much more visible, which is why we saw some of those big headline layoffs from big companies like Google and Amazon and Salesforce. And so this year in 2026 and beyond, growth is going to require a lot stronger execution. And so
mm,
for ecosystem leaders, they need to support businesses who have to manage costs carefully. They have to maintain productivity. They're going to have to justify capital expenditures. And so the analogy I like to use, it's similar to swimming with and without a current. Before the current was pushing us forward and progress felt easy, but now the current is slowing and almost working against us in that way. And so it's just going to require a shift in how we swim and how we train and how we pace ourselves.
mm. And so when you sort of look at an individual business or an individual business owner, what are the things that they're talking about right now that economists don't usually measure well? Like I'm trying to sort
Yeah.
of paint the picture of this is what's happening on the ground. This is like a small business owner perspective. This is what we're hearing about and reading about. And like, here is actually, the mix, the stew that's happening in between.
That's right. Yeah, I think a lot of economists like to think they measure everything well. But being an academic economist and now working in industry, I know that's not always true. I think in terms of what they're talking about right now, that economists don't usually measure perfectly. When I speak with a lot of business owners, one of the common themes I hear is it's not sales are collapsing, it's not the sky is falling, it's that the day-to-day operating environment feels tighter. And
Mm,
so, even when the headline data might look fine, right? And so the tightness is hard to capture in standard economic indicators because it shows up in places like timing of cash flows or margin squeeze, not necessarily in top line revenue or employment counts. And so, a simple way to explain it is that economists are really good at measuring output, like gross domestic product, but owners experience friction. And so, a business can report the same revenue last year as this year, but if payroll costs are higher,
mm,
interest on credit card lines are moving upwards, suppliers are raising prices, then take-home profit shrinks. And so that's the big difference here between revenue and expenses is that margin. It's the cushion that determines whether leaders feel confident enough to hire to invest or expand. And GDP is not going to tell you that cushion is thinning or not.
mhm,
Um, the other thing I think a lot of owners are talking about, and it's rarely captured. So that's the first thing. The second thing is decision fatigue. I hear this a lot. There's just been years of volatility, and a lot of leaders are simply more cautious about making irreversible commitments, right? So they're going to
mhm,
delay maybe making big capital purchases or equipment investments. They might postpone opening a new location, or they might keep a position unfilled longer than they would have. And none of that looks dramatic, but it does meaningfully slow growth at a macro level when all of that is added up. And so the conversation I hear most essentially is we're still operating, but the room for error is a lot smaller. And that's
mm.
that's not a headline statistic. That's more of a behavioral reality.
The poll results suggest that most businesses are either holding steady or delaying growth,
Yeah.
right? Like that's what you've said. I think my question, Matt, is what are the signals to look for to suggest that like maybe things are opening back up, right? If I'm an ecosystem leader, I want to know, like, okay, now it's time to tell my companies, like, we need to go. Like, this is actually the moment. This is where we start to see things start to open back up a little bit. And I'm
Yeah.
curious from your perspective, like, what are you looking for in order to tell, the 2,300 businesses that you all support that it's kind of like opening back up in a way where we can start to make some different decisions ahead of, it becoming obvious.
Yeah, that's good. I think, there's a number of them. Of course, we don't have time to get into all of them, but I think one of the ones that I think is really important to look at is hiring hesitation versus full-on layoffs.
Hmm.
And I think this is one of the earliest signs in confidence shifting. It's not necessarily the layoffs, it's actually the hiring hesitation. Layoffs are dramatic, they're visible, they make headlines. Um, but they typically occur after pressure has been built for some time. And so they're more of a lagging indicator. Hiring hesitation, however, happens earlier and it's a lot more quiet of a behavior. And so when businesses feel confident, they're going to hire ahead of demand.
Hmm.
They bring people on in the anticipation of growth so that when confidence moderates, hiring starts to become more conditional, and business owners are going to ask themselves things like, can we manage the current team a little longer? Can we
Hmm.
improve productivity before adding costs? And so because hiring is one of the most irreversible decisions a business can make, they're going to look at that a lot more deliberately, an environment where confidence is shifting. And so I think, again, to bring it back to the ecosystem leader perspective, the signal is critical because official unemployment rates might look healthy while growth momentum is cooling beneath the surface. And so, if job postings decline or open positions remain unfilled longer than usual, that often reflects caution, not collapse. So, the hiring hesitation tells you that that confidence is moderating.
Hmm. Um, I think you alluded to this, Matt, but I'm going to ask it a little bit more directly for our audience. If you're advising an ecosystem leader to track two, three, maybe four things starting tomorrow, what would they be?
Yeah, well, let me start with what I feel are the most misleading
Yeah.
indicators, first of all,
Cool.
because I think that's especially from an economic perspective. I think oftentimes we go to those headline figures like GDP, like unemployment, and they're important. I don't want to dismiss those. I'm an economist. I look at those all the time. They're very important from a macroeconomic perspective. But when you're talking about regional growth, local growth, um, ecosystem management, they're not irrelevant. They're just less meaningful. Um, GDP growth will tell us total output has increased, but it doesn't explain how difficult that output was to achieve. And so the economy can technically be expanding like we are seeing. The economy is expanding. We got the fourth quarter GDP results, and it shows continued expansion. But if leaders, ecosystem leaders in particular, interpret strong headlines as a green light for aggressive expansion strategies, um, the 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 downside is potentially overlooking the caution businesses are actually signaling here.
Hmm.
And so that's the call out. I think it's just to be careful around focusing more on those major macro indicators than the micro ones that are important in the regional and the ecosystem environment.
Yeah. We've got a question from the audience that I want to make sure we get to. It's related to some of the things we talked about regarding hiring, and I know in our sort of pre-meeting we talked about this a little bit as well. The question is from Jim. He says, "What do you see for the future in the veterinary services in a larger pool of vets and vet techs for hire? And how do practices manage with slim workforces?" And
Oh,
so,
yeah.
and so I think that this is like um, an interesting specific question related to an industry, but one that I think can be extrapolated out to other industries that might also be experiencing some disruption, slim workforces, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a great one. And let me focus on that aspect of the question around slim workforces, because I think this has been a challenging pain point for a lot of markets and industries just around what I call the labor scarcity challenge, is that
Mm.
there's not enough people. A lot of challenges hiring. That's certainly been in my case in the veterinary side, but I know it exists in a lot of other markets and industries too. And it's not just hiring people, it's hiring the right people, the right match of skills, the right blend of experience here. And I think the biggest thing I often bring into those conversations around what do we do in that type of environment is you really have to double down on productivity and efficiency, right? And so there's two ways from an economic perspective to produce output. Um, More labor, more capital, or more effective use of your labor and capital,
Mm.
right? And so I guess that's three ways, not two. That's the approach there. And when labor is scarce and the environment is such that is that capital expansion, you're going into those kinds of things more cautiously. Um, then the other component you have to rely on is productivity and efficiency. And a lot of people tend to think that that means directly technology. Oh, I need more technology in my business. I need more technology in my enterprise. And that can certainly play a role. Talking about AI is going to be a whole other aspect of this conversation. But
Mm.
what I often advise is sometimes it's going back to basics around thinking about all the different areas in which you are managing your business, client communication, client outreach, inventory management, just the operating workflows within your business. Are they streamlined? Or do you have bottlenecks? And that's the thing you have to diagnose. It can be maybe you need a new technology, a new tool, a new platform to drive some of those efficiencies. But more often than not, it's a management issue where you need to go in, diagnose these issues of inefficiency and poor productivity, what the barriers are to reaching peak productivity, and then you start to manage your way out of those issues.
Um, really interesting, I think, perspective for ecosystem builders who are advising small businesses through this challenge for sure. Joyce, do you mind launching I think the third poll we're on because I want to get some perspective from the audience, start to get some perspective from the audience on what they're tracking, what's important, etc. Um, in the meantime, I actually want to go to a question from the audience. This is from Jeff, asking you, Matt, to talk a little bit about the K-shaped economy, how it relates to essentials versus desires.
Yeah, we certainly have talked a lot about that, I think, in the last year or so. I think, the K-shaped economy is basically a visual heuristic of how the economy has recovered and diverged, I would say, more generally. Recovery since, 2008 recession, even post-COVID. But we see this going back even more long term is where you might look at two indices that create this K-shaped effect. And one of the ones you might look at is index value for the S&P 500 or just you pick your stock market, right? And for the last, goodness, 3 decades plus, it's just gone up and up and up. Now, there's been issues with the recession, 2008, 2020, there's been dips, but the long run structural trend has gone up. Another index you might want to compare that to is a sentiment reader.
Mm.
You could look at University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index. The Conference Board is another popular organization there. You could look at growth of average middle class income, middle incomes within the U.S. That either holds flat or when you look at sentiment indicators, it goes downward. And so that creates that bifurcation, that divergence with so-called K-shape. And so what it really is a measure of wealth inequality, income inequality, where you see the top 1%, 0.1%, 0.01% share increasing rapidly, whereas the base, the middle, holding flat or declining in many times in real terms when you're looking at growth rates over time. And so that creates a lot of what I call fissures in an economy. It can create definitely issues around wealth distribution, income distribution, which translates into investments and hesitations to be an active participant in an economy. And things like inflation can hit those different segments of the economy very, very differently and often imbalanced. And so that's the general K shape there.
And what should we do about that?
Yeah.
Right? Like if we because most of the folks on this call, Matt, are probably going to be leading local, regional economies, ecosystems. What's within their realm of influence? What's in their control to at least say, like, maybe we don't want there to be this K-shaped economy. I mean, I know we can't like control everything, but if we were to start to like put our finger on the pulse of some influences, especially as it relates to small business, what would you offer them? What would you tell them to do?
Yeah. I think, and so again, to ground it, asset prices, balance sheets, that's the top leg. We see those growing. Everyday lived experience is that bottom leg. And as other economists have pointed out, and I like to point out, this shows up when you look at income data, wealth distribution. It's just a divergence in who actually feels like they're in a recovery versus a recession, whether or not you're in
Mm.
one. And so why I emphasize that is because for probably a lot of people on this call, many of your clients, your customers, your stakeholders, they're living on the diverging line, not not the upward line for the most part. And so even if the macro data looks fine, even if the markets feel fine, um, for the typical person, for the typical household, they're feeling squeezed. They're feeling squeezed by higher prices, especially for essentials like food, fuel, um, real wages. The growth rate of real wages has been stagnant, rising debt service levels, just generally fading confidence about the future. And so we can't rely on headline market performance as our guide. We've got to, as a business leader, owner, operator, manage the bottom leg of the K. And so, like you said, Sherrod, you can't necessarily change that. We want to, right? But what you can do is successfully manage how you approach your lived reality there, but your customers' lived reality there. And so there's three
Mm.
things I would really advocate for, and we can dig into those. But broadly, they're one, doubling down on trust and communication. If your client or your customer doesn't trust you, if they don't feel that you are clearly communicating, if you're not clearly communicating the value of your products and services to them, they are not going to interact with you. That's the first thing. The second thing is you must demonstrate a very clear value proposition, not just higher prices. So many businesses have had to raise prices. Veterinary practices are one of them because the input costs into delivering a service have increased. Whether it's, your back end suppliers or it's your own labor costs, those are higher. What you can't do in this environment is simply raise prices without clearly communicating the value that's going behind that. And so that's the second one. And then the third one is working within people's budgets. And one of the best ways to do that is trying to soften the blow of the sticker price that may be um, high for some. And so the way you might approach that would be payment options or other pathways where you can soften the financial pain of making a deep purchase, right? And so those are the broad-based three things you want to do is you want to double down on trust, you want to offer clear value, and you want to provide options to your customers in that kind of environment.
It's really interesting. Thank you, Joyce. It's really interesting that, the thing that we are talking about is so esoteric, right? It's so um, sort of like far away. We can't touch it, we can't influence it. But the three things that you named are very much like on the ground solutions and responses to a K-shaped economy. Like I think that that is really empowering to a certain degree. It's sort of like play the game within the confines of the game right now to a certain degree. I think the second question related to that, Matt, is if we think about the fact that most ecosystem builders and economic developers have started focusing on resilience, survival rates, et cetera. What are the levers that they have to then grow their local economies, to grow their regional economies, to grow their ecosystems in an environment where so much of it is focused on like, let's make sure that the small businesses we do have are going to be okay. But obviously, their job is still to kind of grow those areas. So, what advice would you have for them?
Yeah, it's definitely a balance, right? And so this is where you have to straddle the fence between growth and resiliency. And resiliency does drive growth. That's the important thing
Mhm.
to, I think, understand is that if you are building new businesses, but they're failing by year two or by year three, you have a massively sinking ship on your hands, right?
Mhm.
And so that growth has to be sustainable. And so I think one of the most important shifts here I'm seeing for support organizations in an ecosystem environment is moving beyond just the expansion metrics. Um, in high growth periods, yes, it makes sense to emphasize things like startup counts or rapid hiring, square footage developed. Those are
Mhm.
visible indicators of momentum that we don't want to lose. But in a disciplined economic phase, which we're in and will continue to be in for some time, expansion can't be the only measure of health. And so I think ecosystem leaders are going to need to continue to push for um, aggressive growth targets while without accounting for margin pressure. But they're also going to need to look at startups launching um, and be concerned about those that are launching without operational resilience and what that might mean to their potential future there. And so I think what needs to stop is the reflex to equate speed with success here is not just how many businesses do we launch this quarter, but leaders asking the question, how many businesses strengthen their operating capacity or how many improved productivity or profitability? A good tangible example here is I think of a typical chamber of commerce that might typically run programs focused on scaling quickly might also consider instead, in addition to rather, offering workshops on things like cash flow management
Mm.
or cost control strategies or operational optimization. And these might sound less glamorous, but they're so highly relevant in a very margin sensitive environment that we're in right now.
Yeah. Um, I think taking that one step further, Matt, as we wrap this conversation, I think that that is directly aligned with the poll results we just saw, which talked about cash flow pressure, pricing increases, all the things you've already said. If you ran a chamber of commerce, an economic development organization, or an innovation center, what's the first thing you change based on what you're seeing?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think Um, the first thing I might do is call you and ask you for some advice and help Sherrod. But the second thing I would do is I would change my primary metric for success, or I would add to it. I would add to it to not just measure expansion, but in addition measure durability. And so we've lived in for the last many years up until around, the pandemic, what a lot of economists would call a high growth cycle. And so in that type of environment, it makes sense to track things like startup counts or ribbon cuttings, again, square foot developed, like I mentioned. And those are visible and very energizing indicators. And again, they need to be maintained. But in a disciplined environment where margins are tighter, capital is more selective and businesses are more cautious, the question now becomes how strong are the businesses that we already have? And so
Mm,
what I would immediately do is implement something like a regional durability dashboard to complement the growth dashboard, something that focuses um, on not only how many firms are we launching this year, but track their survival rates, their profitability health. If possible, look at things like productivity improvements. Those indicators are going to tell you whether the economic base is strengthening or just expanding.
mm,
And then I would also prioritize structured listening sessions because not all of this is going to be able to be captured by the data. I'm an economist. I love quantitative data. But I also recognize there's a lot of knowledge and wisdom in the qualitative data. And so I would prioritize listening sessions with business owners, not just surveys, but in-depth conversations about hiring hesitation or financing behavior or operational friction. And so that qualitative insight is only going to surface in those conversations. And it's also going to provide the turning points in your region before the macro data even confirms it there.
I love the idea of having sort of a growth and expansion dashboard and also, a resiliency, durability dashboard. Matt, thank you so much for the time today. I certainly have learned a lot. I think it's been a really interesting conversation to sort of take what's happening at the macro level from an economy standpoint and talk about A, its impact on small businesses, but also B, and for our audience, what ecosystem builders and ecosystem leaders can do about that. And so hopefully folks have a starting point to have some of those conversations in their own ecosystems and their own regions. And as always, we will follow up with the recording. There will likely be a blog post about this. And if you're interested in staying connected with Ecomap, you can find us on all major social platforms, ecomap_tech. Matt, any final words before we close out?
Yeah, one, thank you for the time and the opportunity to share this with you and your audience and your stakeholders. And secondly, I like to think of myself as a hopeful economist. I am not a dismal one. We're in a tough economic environment, but we will get through this. You focus on the right strategies and the right metrics for success. And I truly believe any region, any market, any business can not only survive in a tough economic environment, but they can come out of it thriving. And so hang in there.
Thanks, Matt. Great way to close. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you all joining us. Take care.